Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. As a lifelong resident of the city of Baltimore and a history, particularly as it relates to our city and our country's history, we understand and know really important dates. One of those dates is 1619, when slaves were brought to this country. Another date is a date of 1863, when supposedly those slaves were set free. Another date is 1911, where this council and the body that I chair as president decided to enact the first racial segregation zoning law in this entire country. That led to the map that we affectionately call a redlining map of 1936. Now that we sit here in 2023, we still see those inequities persist throughout our community. One of the main byproducts of moving away from the idea of slavery as it relates to shackles, as it relates to people being utilized as tools, as it relates to people being seen as property, was to ensure that our criminal justice system replaced it. And in doing so, one of the biggest avenues that took place was the war on drugs. Now, I don't care what part of the city you live in. If you are conscious to anything, you would be able to quickly understand and know that the statistics around the criminal justice system here in the city of Baltimore, particular to marijuana arrests, convictions, and punishment, far exceed and disproportionately represented in African American neighborhoods. Ultimately, Baltimore had one of the highest arrest rates in this entire country as it relates to marijuana possession. This has residual effect, not just to the individual who was arrested, not just to their family, but also to their communities. And the collateral consequences of stopping folks from having quality access, of finding jobs, voting, getting licenses, finding stable housing, and much, much more is played out on our city streets on a daily basis. This bill establishes the first time the Community Reinvestment and Reparations Commission to guarantee that the tax revenue generated from the legal sale of marijuana is provided to those communities that were most impacted by the criminalization of marijuana. With the passage of this bill, we begin to repair harms of the past that has destroyed our communities in ways that are unspeakable. I look forward to the conversation around this matter, not only with my colleagues, but more importantly with the community, to ensure that the dignity and the equity and opportunities that have been stolen from communities through these draconian racist practices are dealt with. I want to be very clear that this is not the end-all, be-all. This is not the formative or holistic representation of what reparations looks like in our country, but it is a start. I know there's many folks in city government that did not want the term reparations put on this bill and in this commission, but I think that it's critically important for us to start that discussion today and now. I would like to thank the folks in the state who wisely decided to develop a fund in perpetuity as it relates to ensuring that corrective actions of wrongdoings of the past and the draconian policies that we have talked about and will talk about today are done in an appropriate manner. So, Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of this bill. I look forward to a speedy as well as successful process in getting this bill passed.
Committee, the state of Maryland put forth legislation to correct an injustice. As always, Baltimore, again, is one of the first jurisdictions to move ahead with implementation of a new law. It seems that Baltimore is the risk taker on new initiatives like body cameras, the youth fund, and affordable housing. We move forward for the benefit of the people. We take risks for the benefit of our communities. This bill serves as an example of the city being on the front line to correct an injustice.
This is something that has meant a lot to Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We've been talking about reparations for a while, but particularly as we know with the multi-billion-dollar industry of recreational cannabis coming online, it was important for us that there was an emphasis on making sure that our community, Black folks, benefited from this multi-billion-dollar industry, and that our benefit to the industry was not predicated primarily on getting access to the business, to participating in the industry itself, but having an avenue where the resources come back to the communities impacted by the war on drugs, because that's a part of the debt that is due. What I want to do is I want to talk broadly about reparations and the war on drugs, and then I want to talk about the state bill, and then I want to go through this particular bill that's before you, if that's all right. When we talk about the problem that Black people face in this society, often it's understood primarily through the lens of racial inequality, which in many contexts is an appropriate lens. But it's also important to recognize that it is a societal attack on the humanity of people of African descent that stripped our ability to participate and practice sovereignty and self-determination. That the ability for individual people to experience a good quality of life is largely determined by being a member of a group or entity or an institution that has the ability to navigate society from a position of strength and power. So when we look at enslavement and colonialism, and we think about the broader conversation about reparations, we're talking about our ability to practice sovereignty and freedom being disrupted. Historical narratives about, whether we're talking about enslavement or even when we're talking about the 20th century as it relates to the Civil Rights Act, often we're taught that Black people have been able to get progress based on our ability to petition white people to recognize our humanity. And it is that narrative that is often framed the kinds of policy and legislative actions that have been taken forward. So for instance, when you think about chattel slavery, often we're told that the abolitionist movement petitioned to white people about the evils of enslavement, and that led to this moral awakening that led to the Civil War. But if we're honest about what actually precipitated the end of enslavement, we're talking about the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, and the slave rebellion, the enslaved Africans who rebelled against colonial powers, that inspired folks like Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, that inspired rebellions that made it out of, or not in the interest of enslavement to continue to exist because of the sovereign attacks from people of African descent against this oppressive system. That's an important framing. Also the decision of Black people to support the Union in the Civil War. This is Black people getting our own freedom, and those who are interested in helping to support that, being allies to that. That's an extremely important reframe. And so the conversation about reparations as it exists in the mainstream often relies primarily on the idea of Black people primarily as recipients of services, primarily on the idea of our community reinforcing in our community a benevolent relationship to the institutions that exist outside of us, that we're often made to be dependent on institutions outside of our community. The genealogy of reparations advocacy rests squarely in the Black nationalist Pan-Africanist tradition. And this perspective is important because we're looking at how do we invest in Black people's ability as a people to build the institutions and ecosystems of institutions necessary to be able to practice self-determination and freedom. And that's important, and that's a part of why, when I talk about the specific bill, why it's framed so broadly in terms of how those resources are spent, because we need the flexibility to look at what are the kinds of institutions that our community needs to practice freedom. I'll give one example here, just so when I get to it, it's more clear. One of the challenges of Baltimore City has been the fiscal sponsorship landscape. Grassroots organizations typically don't have the infrastructure capacity to receive large sums of public dollars. And so if we're going to be able to practice sovereignty and self-determination, we need those big intermediary entities that can receive public dollars and actually get them to grassroots organizations. This is something that, if we're going to talk about reparations, is an example of something that is an investment in the community's ability to be able to practice sovereignty and freedom, to be able to distribute resources in its own community in a way that it desires, as opposed to having to rely on communities outside of ours to handle those large sums of public dollars. So that's just one example of what distinguishes the reparations framework from a kind of traditional big state liberal government framework that I think too often gets conflated when we talk about reparations. War on drugs, I don't need to go into that. I think Council President did a great job at talking about the war on drugs and its impact on our community. And so the reason the cannabis prohibition policy is linked to reparations in this context is because the war on drugs was one of the major historical phenomena that dehumanized people of African descent. And as a start to reparations, we think given the cannabis legalization, this is a good start to look at the war on drugs and look at ways to repair the damage of the war on drugs, but again, not stopping there. All right, so I want to talk about the state bill. So HB 837 was passed during the last Maryland General Assembly. There was a bill that the LBS worked on and a variety of other organizations worked on that was sponsored by Senator Joe Carter. It was the Repair the War on Drugs Reparations Act. The fund that was established that ultimately ended up in HB 837 originates from Senator Carter's bill. And that was included in the bill that ultimately passed the Maryland General Assembly. And so a part of that bill, there are a variety of things that bill does, right? What's relevant to today's conversation is the establishment of the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. And the way that it's written in the statute, there are a few things that I think are important in discussing today's bill. The first is that 30% of revenues from taxes from recreational cannabis goes into a fund to this Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. What then happens is that the Attorney General's office will make a determination as to the statewide, each jurisdiction's cannabis-related arrest over a 20-year period, from 2002 to 2022. So over that 20-year period, the Attorney General will calculate the percentage that each jurisdiction contributed to statewide cannabis-related arrests, with the idea being that the distribution of resources should be commensurate with the damage done to those particular jurisdictions. So with this formula, Baltimore City, Prince George's County, those are the jurisdictions that will likely get the largest sum of the resources because that's where the largest amount of arrests occurred, right? And so they should get the largest percentage of those resources. The comptroller's responsibility, as is the case with state money, to hold those monies and distribute it to the jurisdictions. What the bill then also says is that each jurisdiction is to pass a law that determines how they spend their portion of those funds. I want to take a moment to address some of the things addressed by the law department, just to be clear in terms of, because we were a part of writing the statute that produces this as a part of a legislative mandate, which is essentially what this bill attempts to do, is to fulfill a legislative mandate of HB 837 and passing law to determine how these resources are spent. And so HB 837 does not preclude the establishment of a commission, but again was intentionally broad to allow jurisdictions to make determinations as to what makes sense in their jurisdiction. So while it does not authorize outright the development of a commission, it does not preclude it. And so the reason that we went with a commission, when you look around the country, many of the reparations efforts that have been taking hold around the United States have used commissions as a part of determining how those resources are spent. So in many ways, borrowing from a practice that's been done around the country on the issue of reparations. So in terms of this particular bill that's before you, what I want to emphasize, it was important for us to ensure that the expenditure of the resources that come from this fund are not just subject to an executive being able to determine where all the money goes. And we were really clear about that, which is why the provision that was included around the local legislatures determining where the money goes, that's why that was there. So we're talking about legislative intent. The legislative intent was to curtail the ability of an executive, a mayor or county executive, to solely determine where those resources go. And so it is important for us that when we think about how to structure this commission, we wanted to ensure that the city council rather, is involved, because as you know, people have more access to you all than they do the mayor, and gives people the opportunity to advocate for things that they think in their community make sense under the reparations framework. And so it includes, there's an amendment that Councilmember Net will include in this bill that we worked with him on, that would essentially borrow from a process similar to what this council did with the police accountability boards, which is essentially allowing the council to make recommendations to the mayor, because unfortunately the charter says that only the mayor can make appointments. but allowing the council to make recommendations and for the mayor to appoint from those recommendations allows some distribution of some diffusal of power, again, out of the executive and into the hands of the council, which is more proximate to the community. And then the last thing that I want to talk about, highlight in the bill, in terms of the qualifications for serving on the commission. You know, as I mentioned, the difference between reparations and just the general idea, the progressive idea of investing in social programs are two different approaches and policies. And so we wanted to ensure that among the qualifications that people that serve on this commission are folks that have some history of doing some kind of education or producing educational material or advocacy on the issue of reparations, so that that framework, that distinction of the framework is made clear and is represented on the commission.
So good afternoon again. I'm Nnamdi. I'm the creator of Fight Blight, Bmore, and the co-creator of the Stop Oppressive Seizures Fund. I'm here in support of City Council Bill 230353. If we think about the space, place, and positionality of Black people in Baltimore from 1776 into today, we understand the importance of a bill for reparations such as this, particularly because the city has used police power in a number of different ways in order to harm Black folks and Black families and the Black community. And that's whether we're talking about chattel enslavement in the 1700s or the Black codes that were, particularly vagrancy laws, school construction, and all of those things in the 1800s, particularly as it pertains to those Black folks who were actually supposed to be free in Baltimore. And as we move into the 1900s, when we look at all of the housing policy, like the City Council President mentioned with Ordinance 610, but extending to restrictive covenants, tax sale, eminent domain, urban renewal, and all of those things, and even into the current time when we're looking at subprime lending, the dismantling of public housing, and the apportionment of public funds for development in Baltimore, we see that the disparities that have been created by the police power of this council and of the mayor and of the agencies in this city means that there is definitely a need for reparations, and we support that for this particular bill. I want to just make one very clear point about how this shows up in terms of home or land ownership. According to Baltimore Heritage, in 1789, there were 8 Black families who owned property in the city. The average value of their property was $226. The average value at that time of a white family's property was $1,479. Today, we know that in this city, according to Redfin, Black homeowners see a disparity of $50,000 for each property. So from 1798 till today, if we look at the proportion of the disparity, it has actually grown, the disparity in what the value of Black people's property is, from the period of enslavement to a time when we're supposed to be free. That is the direct result of the punitive economy, which was created by policy, by this council, by the mayor, by the Department of Housing and Community Development, and all of those things use the police power, to take from Black folks. And so it is important that this bill go forward in its current state in order to begin to address the disparities of the war on drugs, the war on poverty, and all of those other uses of police power against Black people, Black families, and the Black community.
Madam Chair, Mr. President, I guess as an academic, I just want to say that I've been studying the issue of reparations for 35 years. In fact, Hakeem mentioned Randall Robinson, who passed this past Friday in St. Kitts, and his book was called The Debt. And the book that I wrote about reparations is called should America pay, which was answering that question. I'd like to, begin a brief testimony by reading a quotation from the late Ralph Wiley. He said, "Give me the labor of one black person for 1 year, I would be a rich man. Give me the labor of a dozen black people for 12 years, I would be a very rich man. Give me the free labor of millions of black people for 250 years, I would be America." The first American that really advocated for reparations was a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln, who in December of 1864 ordered his general William T. Sherman to distribute 40 acres, and there was no mule, although it has become popular in history to say 40 acres and a mule. It was like if you sold land to a person in 1864, you would assume that it had a mule. It would be like me selling a car right now, and you assume that it has an engine in it. I want to just say some of the objections and some of the precedents for reparations in this country. In 1971, $1 billion and 4 million acres of land were given to the Alaska Natives Land Settlement, the people we know as Eskimos. In 1980, 81 million were given to the Klamath tribe of Oregon. In 1985, 105 million for the Lakotas of South Dakota. And in 1990, that very radical president, Ronald Reagan, gave $1.2 billion for the Japanese Americans for their internment during World War II. I think opponents of reparations usually say things like, but slavery happened a long time ago. Why should I pay for something that I never participated in? And believe it or not, I was not born during World War II, and I had nothing to do with this detention of Japanese Americans in World War II. But part of my 1988 taxes went to payment of reparations for the Japanese, and rightly so. Other opponents say reparations are a racial shakedown and a government handout. Reparations have nothing to do with a handout. It has everything to do with the issue of justice. Another one is, but my family came to America after slavery on Ellis Island. We weren't even in the country when it practiced enslavement. But you are now a citizen of the United States, and as a citizen of the United States, you have an obligation to pay for this nation's crimes against humanity. And then the last one, how do you determine who gets reparations? How will you pay them? Will you just send people a check in the mail? I'm always amused by this one simply because of the fact that we always talk about the complexity of distribution of reparation, and the most complex institution that we had in this country's history was enslavement itself. And so we can work that out. H.R. 40 has a lot to do with that. And finally, reparations are going to divide the races even further. Why can't we just leave the past alone? Can we all just get along? I call that the Rodney King defense. We have always been divided as a nation on the issue of race because we have not looked honestly at the issue of racism and its impact on black people in this country at all. And I think until we do, and I hope that the council implements this bill, I hope that we do because I think it will give an honest dialogue at last to Baltimore and its surrounding communities. Thank you.
We gather here today, and it's important to acknowledge the wound. I'm going to speak in broad terms. The experts have been very specific. I just want to stand here and speak to share why I believe it's important. We acknowledge the deep wounds that have been inflicted upon Africans globally and in the diaspora nationally, as well as locally here. And we look to see that for centuries, Africans have experienced trauma, terrorism, domestic terrorism, economic violence, racial inequality, resulting in lineage and racial wealth gap that still persists to this day. This damage that has done has been immeasurable, and it's time that we take action to repair it. Healing City, Baltimore Trauma Response Care Act, the Community Investment and Reparations Commission is a step in the right direction. As I stated, many of our ancestors have been fighting and struggling for righteousness and for justice. And even though these legal policies are forwarded and we look to represent the community reinvestment, it's not enough. We must go further and commit to the reparations. Black residents here in Baltimore City, wealth has been plundered, and it's time for that debt to be repaid. The question then becomes, what kind of money does it take to get the job done? Well, we must be committed to strongly considering the Community Reinvestment and Reparations Committee for Economic and Community Development as a tool in the essence and the nature that it was designed in. This bill must be specifically and methodically targeted towards those who have been oppressed, and certain protections must also be put in place to ensure that when this bill is passed, erasure and dismantling and omission does not occur as a result of white lash. This cannot be a piecemeal approach. Reparations for Baltimore City residents must not only be local, but also a governmental and federal initiative. It takes a lot more time to heal a wound than to inflict it, and America has been inflicting wounds, and so also has Baltimore historically for centuries. We cannot simply wait for this time to heal, and I, at this point, even though I promote and support this bill, I no longer wait for white people's humanity. And we must do what it is to be just and fair. And when I make that statement, I make it as an observation. It's not as an indictment. I just have a healthy suspicion of white people based on history. Reparations for Black residents of Baltimore will be transformative based on the actions of Africans as we move towards sovereignty. And we look to create and close the lineage and racial wealth gap and provide a pathway towards healing the trauma and economic violence that has been inflicted upon us and my community for years and years. We cannot afford to wait any longer. The time is now for reparations. The American Medical Association has featured an apology. The Pediatric Society has forwarded an apology. There have been many apologies that have been forwarded. There's lots of books. If you're under some rock or something, I don't know where you've been. Let's promote this policy, move it forward, and I just want to thank my ancestors' best wish. And I just want to say thank you all.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Good afternoon to the committee. I just want to say thank you to Council President Mosby as well as Councilman Burnett for sponsoring this bill. I also want to thank Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle for their hard-earned work on this legislation as well. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Maryland, founder of Son of a Dream Services and Multimedia Resources. I'm also the president of Baltimore Legacy Association of Black Social Workers. The perspective I have in support of this bill is really looking at the harm that's done. When we look at the mass incarceration and mass arrest that has happened for decades in Baltimore City, I myself and colleagues have to assist with the aftermath of it. The aftermath is this: what is the cost of all this? You know, right or wrong, what happens to the families once a loved one is incarcerated? And oftentimes I get front row seats. Like today, my session earlier, I get front row seats to trauma. when families are ripped apart, when mothers and fathers are forced to go away for whatever reason, I have to hold space for black boys that's dealing with the anger of their father not being there. The morality of right or wrong and laws doesn't come into play. What does come into play is the absence of a parent, the absence of not being picked up from school, the absence of not having a football thrown around the backyard, also the absence of being at graduations. I go back to a session that I had a few years ago that really underscored how deep this goes. When I was sitting in a session with this young man, and I asked about, I pointed out his anger and frustration and asked him, how is it tied to his father, the absence of his father? And the response was almost visceral when he said, "'Cause he left me out here by myself." Keep in mind that this was a young man that hasn't seen his father his entire life free. At the time, I say he was about 17 years old, and his father spent his entire life incarcerated. And years later, that same young man was murdered in 2019, and only had the opportunity to be with and spend time with his father with roughly a year and a half. So we're talking about, why is this necessary, particularly when we have the opportunity to do something very impactful, which is assist those families, assist those loved ones that are returning back to our community, and not only adjusting to our society once again, but how to repair the damage that happened to their family, how to mend these relationships. And that's where my colleagues now come into play as therapists, as social workers, working with these families to help identify reconciliation, help to address anger, help to address trauma, and the need for the funding, the resources, the agencies and the professionals who are responsible for this task, that oftentimes we throw people away for their actions, and we don't think about what happens when folks come home 5, 10, 15, 20 years later. What happens next? And like I said before, my colleagues now are responsible for what happens next. Their adjustment back into coming home, their adjustment to navigating society, their adjustment to navigating new workspaces, their adjustment to navigating relationships with family, which is very real. Mending that anger, that frustration, that resentment, which is not easy. So I close with this, that as someone in the helping profession, as someone that proudly serves the people of Baltimore, particularly black men and boys, if we are serious about the betterment of our city, if we are serious about the betterment of our communities, then we must be serious about the investment in assisting black men and boys in our city. Thank you.